In the earlier video, we showed you how to read the poem, to focus on the whole first and then on the parts. The essence of the poem lies in the whole. We then introduced you to the poet George Gordon, who is commonly known as Lord Byron, and the experience behind the poem The Prisoner of Chillon. We also narrated a selection, 68 lines, from the poem The Prisoner of Chillon, a Fable, by Lord Byron, and asked you to read it aloud at least twice. We then said that the first step to understand the poem is to paraphrase its stanzas or lines and then summarize it based on your paraphrase. We showed you how to paraphrase the first 16 lines of the 68 lines selected for you from The Prisoner of Chillon, and then asked you to paraphrase the rest. Then to use the paraphrase to summarize the whole poem. If you hadn't paraphrased lines 16 till 68 yet, please stop this video now and paraphrase them now before we proceed. And before you proceed further into literal paraphrase of the poem, we need to make sure that we know all the words in the poem. This is where you can consult a dictionary to do that. We'll provide, however, some of the words that we think you will need to know as to complete the paraphrase successfully. Note that the meanings of the words are based on the context. As you know by now, words can have multiple meanings according to the context. Let's start with the first word. Toil means hard work. Vile means evil or sickening. Repose means rest. Fair means freedom. Tenets means principles or beliefs. Lineal means direct, in a straight, unbroken line of descent from parent to child. Dwelling means housing that someone is living in. Persecution means causation to suffer or abuse, especially on the basis of race or religion. Foes means enemies. Crevice means crack. Cleft means crevice or fissure. Cankering means a pernicious and maddening infection that is hard to get rid of, like a fungus infection. Over means over. Livid means lacking rigor or energy. Solace means comfort or consolation. Dearth means acute shortage, paucity. Hearken means listen. Grating means unpleasantly harsh. Now that we have paraphrased the first 16 lines of The Prisoner of Chillon and knew some of the important words in the poem selection, we will paraphrase lines 17 to 68 and then use the paraphrase to summarize the poem selection. Note that the lines 1 to 26 is stanza 1, lines 27 till 47 is stanza 2, and lines 48 to 68 is stanza 3. You might also find the poem written in shorter stanzas on the internet. This is not how it was originally written by Lord Byron. This is because some publishers thought it's easy for the common reader to understand and see the rhyme scheme better. Remember, a paraphrase is quite casual and it doesn't capture the beauty and imagery of the poem, but it should give you some idea of the literal meaning. In lines 17 to 20 of the stanza 1, the poet says, "We were 7 who now are 1, 6 in youth and 1 in age, finished as they had begun, proud of persecution's rage." Here, the speaker says that there had been 7 people in his family, the father and his 6 sons, but now he's the only one left. The 6 that died all died as they lived, proud to be persecuted for their beliefs. The speaker then ends stanza 1 with 21 lines 21 to 26 when he says, "Proud of persecution's rage, one in fire and two in field, the belief with blood have sealed, dying as the Father died, for the God the foes denied. 3 were in a dungeon cast, of whom this wreck is left the last." Here the speaker starts listing how all his brothers died. One of them died in fire, so probably by being burnt at the stake like the fathers in line stated in line 13. 2 of them died on the field of battle. Those first 3 all died like the dead, for believing in a God that an enemy is denied. So here it seems like the family is being persecuted for their religious beliefs, but elsewhere in the poem it's very ambiguous, it's not very clear. The other 3 were thrown into the prison, and the speaker is the last of the 3 to survive. He calls himself a wreck because he's an old and grey, mentioned in line 1, from his time in prison. In stanza 2, lines 27 to 35, the speaker says, "There are 7 pillars of Gothic mould in Sheol's dungeons deep and old. There are 7 columns massy and grey, dim with a dull imprisoned ray, a sunbeam which has lost its way, and through the crevice and the clefts of the thick wall is fallen and left, creeping over the floor so damp, like the marshal's meteor lamp." The second stanza begins by describing the speaker's prison. The dungeon has 7 Gothic-looking pillars. A Gothic pillar, if you were wondering, is one that holds up Gothic-style arches. These 7 pillars probably represent each of the 7 members of the speaker's family, his father, his 5 brothers, and him. These 7 columns are massive, massy, and dim. Dungeons are known for the paucity of lighting. Even a single sunbeam that seems to have found its way into the dungeon looks imprisoned down there. The speaker even says that the sunbeam has gotten lost. Light does not belong there. The ray of light must have worked its way in through some crack or cleft in the wall. The sunbeam creeps over the clammy, damp floor of the dungeon, and the speaker compares it to a meteor lamp in a marsh or swamp. We're still in the second stanza, now lines 36 to 44, where the speaker says, "And in each pillar there is a ring, and in each ring there is a chain. The iron is a cankering thing, for in these limbs its teeth remain, with marks that will not wear away till I have done with this new day, which now is painful to these eyes, which have not seen the sun to rise for years. I cannot count them over." The speaker here seems to focus more on the description of the pillars and chains. He says that each of the 7 pillars has a ring on it that holds a chain. The speaker says that the iron of the chains cankers or festers and plagues him. He says that the teeth marks of the iron are still visible in his arms and legs. They won't wear off until he dies, that is, until he is done with this new day. Even the new day is a source of pain for him, since he hasn't seen the sunrise in so many years that he's lost count. Stanza 2 ends with lines 45 to 47, where the speaker says, "I lost the long and heavy score when my last brother drooped and died, and I lay living by his side." The speaker says that he stopped counting the days and years they spent in prison after his last brother died, and he alone survived. In stanza 3, lines 48 to 53, the speaker continues and says, "They chained us each to a column stone, and we were 3, yet each alone. We could not move a single pace, we could not see each other's face, but with that pale and livid light that made us strangers in our sight." Here he says that each of the 3 brothers was chained to one of the 7 pillars, so that even Though they shared a dungeon, they were isolated from each other. They weren't able to move at all, not even to take a single step. They couldn't even see each other's face properly because it was so dim in the dungeon. In the gloom, his brothers' faces looked like strangers to him. In lines 54 to 62, we're still in stanza 3, he says, "And thus together, yet apart, fettered in hand, but joined in heart, 'twas still some solace in the dearth of the pure elements of earth, to hearken to each other's speech, and each turn comfort to each, with some new hope or legend old, or song heroically told, bold. But even these of length grew cold." The three brothers are imprisoned together, and yet separately. Their hands are chained, fettered, but their hearts are still joined together. But at least they had the comfort of being able to talk to each other, even in the absence of dearth, which is fresh air, light and water, the pure elements of earth, as mentioned in the poem. The brothers take turns comforting each other. They offer each other hope, and sometimes share stories and legends about brave heroes. But after a while, even those stories and legends stop comforting them. He ends stanza 3 with lines 63 to 68. He says, "Our voices took a dreary tone, an echo of the dungeon stone, a grating sound not full and free, as they of yore were wont to be. It might be fancy, but to me they never sounded like our own." Here the speaker says that after a while their voices started sounding dreary and sad in the echoes of the dungeon. Even the voices start to sound imprisoned. They take on a grating sound and don't sound as full and free as they did before they were thrown in the prison. The speaker admits that he could be imagining this, fancying it, but to him their voices didn't sound right somehow when they were in the dungeon. Now, look at the paraphrasing we did together of the stanzas 1 to 3 of the poem. Are you able to summarize them? Please pause this video now and summarize it before we proceed. Stanzas 1 to 3 describe the prisoner's unhappy state. His hair is grey and his arms and legs bowed, line 5, from his long imprisonment. The prisoner states that he has been imprisoned for his father's faith, line 11. The speaker's family was once made up of 7 people, the father and his 6 children, but now only the prisoner himself remains alive. Their deaths were not natural, due to persecution. 7 Gothic pillars hold up the heavy roof of this dark prison. A single sunbeam comes in through a crack in the wall. Each pillar has an iron ring through which is attached a chain that binds the prisoner to the pillar. The prisoner notes that he has been there for years, long enough to be the last survivor among the 3 brothers. Although chained to a pillar in the same room as his 2 brothers, the prisoner is unable to see them or move so as to draw any nearer to either brother. Only the voices are able to share comfort, but even those give out eventually, and their raw throats are no longer capable of uttering sounds that sound like the familiar voices. In terms of the setting of the poem, the literal setting of the prison of Chillon, as we said before, is a real-life prison on the banks of Lake Geneva in Switzerland. But in the world of this poem, the literal setting isn't as important as the emotional, affective setting. In the mind of the speaker, it doesn't really matter where the prison is. He's stuck in his cell and can hardly see out the grate. By the end of the poem, if you want to read the whole poem, his cell becomes his whole world. He's been there too long, or so long, he doesn't know how to cope with freedom. Now, what about the speaker? We explained before that the speaker is the voice of Bonivard as imagined by Lord Byron. However, we need to get more close to the speaker in the poem itself and not to the historical character of Bonivard. We need to look closely at the speaker's stance, chosen words, and especially syntax, how the sentences and lines are ordered and how they run after each other. The speaker of the Prison of Sheol is admirable in a lot of ways. He's courageous enough to face life in prison without batting an eye, and he's willing to be martyred for his beliefs. He's also a good older brother and tries to set an example for his two brothers in prison. He speaks in long, rambling sentences. Just look at this first stanza, lines 1 to 26. That's all one sentence from line 1 to line 26. He uses a lot of dashes and semicolons, which make the poem seem much more conversational. The speaker is talking to us or to himself, which is a monologue, about everything that has happened to him since he was thrown in prison. This seems as a monologue, or what we call dramatic monologue poem. It's almost as though he's trying to understand it himself by going over it in his mind. After all, the time that passed since his youngest brother died is mostly blank to him. He stopped counting the days at that point. So long, rambling sentences actually make some sense, given the speaker's state of mind. He's trying to piece together the long, blurry period of time since he was thrown in prison, and his syntax reflects that. So far, we have tried to understand the literal meaning of the poem, looked at the setting of the poem, and then we're going to try to derive the themes later. Now, before we proceed any further, we will now need to brush on some literary devices and learn some others that are new that will help you in analyzing the poem. Let's start with the first literary device. A metaphor is a figure of speech that makes an implicit, implied, or hidden comparison between two things that are unrelated, but which share some common characteristics. In other words, a resemblance of two contradictory or different objects is made based on a single or some common characteristics. For example, when you say that the assignment was a breeze, it implies that the assignment was not difficult. Or when you say that the skies of his future began to darken, this means that darkness is a threat. Therefore, this implies that the coming times are going to be hard for him. Personification is a figure of speech in which a thing, an idea, or an animal is given human attributes. The wind whispered through dry grass is an example of personification because we are giving the wind a human attribute, the act of whispering. Consonance refers to repetition or repetitive sounds produced by consonants within a sentence or a phrase or among lines in a poem. This repetition often takes place in quick succession, such as in pitter-patter. It is classified as a literary device used in both poetry as well as prose. For instance, the words chuckle, fickle, and kick are consonants with one another, due to the existence of common interior consonant sound k. The literary device of consonants is inherently different from assonance, which involves the repetition of similar vowel sounds within a word, sentence, or phrase. Another distinction to be appreciated is that between consonance and rhyme. In the case of rhyme, consonant sounds can be present at the beginning, middle, or end of several successive words, rather than merely at the end of words. Further, the device of consonants needs to be distinguished from alliteration. In contrast to alliteration, consonance involves repetition of consonant sounds only. Let's look at an example in poetry with the poem titled "It Was Later When the Summer Went" by Emily Dickinson. She says, "It was later when the summer went, then when the cricket came, and yet we knew that gentle clock meant naught but going home. 'Twas sooner when the cricket went than when the winter came, yet that pathetic pendulum keeps esoteric time." If you look at the series of the sound throughout all the lines in the stanza, these are consonants. Consonants is commonly employed in a range of situations, from poetry to prose writing. However, as the example given above highlight, the use of consonants is significantly greater in poetry writing than in prose form. The use of consonants provides the structure of poetry with a rhyming effect. A writer normally employs the tool of consonants for the purpose of reiterating the significance of an idea or theme. Further, the use of the device makes the structure of poetry or prose appealing for the reader. The poet generally makes use of consonants in an attempt to underscore the emotions behind their words that simply words cannot convey. Furthermore, the use of consonants adds a lyrical feeling to the poetry that otherwise cannot be added. The significance of the use of consonants in poetry is enhanced by the fact that it is often used to make the imagery clearer. It acts as a tool that enables the poet to formulate a fine and powerful structure for his poetry and to create background for the themes underlying the poetry. Parallelism is the use of components in a sentence that are grammatically the same. My guess is that you've taken that in grammar and you can relate that to grammar as well. Or it can be similar in their construction, sound, meaning, or meter. Parallelism examples are found in literary works as well as in ordinary conversations. This method adds balance and rhythm to sentences, giving ideas a smoother flow and thus persuasiveness because of the repetition it employs. For example, Alice ran into the room, into the garden, and into our hearts. We see the repetition of the phrase that not only gives the sentence a balance but rhythm and flow as well. This repetition can also occur in similarly structured clauses such as, "Whenever you need me, wherever you need me, I will be there for you." Now let's look at an example in literature in the poem "The Tiger" by William Blake, where he says, "What the hammer, what the chain, in what furnace was thy brain? What the anvil, what dread grasp, there its deadly terrors clasp." Blake uses better structure, starting with "what" in each phrase, creating a beautiful rhythm in the above lines. Now let's look at a very important literary device in this poem. It's called the rhyme scheme. Rhyme scheme is the pattern of rhyme that comes at the end of each verse or line in poetry. In other words, it is the structure of end words of a verse or line that the poet needs to create when writing a poem. Many poems are written in free verse style. Some other poems follow non-rhyming structures, paying attention only to the number of syllables. To find the rhyme scheme, look at sound of the last syllable in each line and mark each syllable sound with a letter. Same syllable sounds have the same letter. Here is an example, titled called "Neither Out Far Nor In Deep" by Robert Frost. The people along the sand all turn and look one way. They turn their back on the land, they look at the sea all day. As long as it takes to pass, a ship keeps raising its hull. The wetter ground like glass reflects a standing gull. The last words in each line are sand, way, land, day, pass, hull, glass, and gull. Now, way and day have the same sound, so we label them as A and A. Sorry, we label sand and land as A and A, and then we label way and day as B. And we look at the second two. These are pass and glass. They have the same sound, so we label them as C and C. And then hull and gull, they have the same sound, so we label them as D and D. Therefore, the rhyme scheme, if you look at all the end of the lines as you letter them, the rhyme scheme of the lines above is A, B, C, D, C, D. And that's called the rhyme scheme. The form of a poem is how we describe the overarching structure of the pattern of the poem. The poem's form can be identified by analyzing its structure. Poems may be divided into stanzas with different numbers of lines. Looking at the layout of a poem is a good way to start identifying the form. For example, considering the use of stanzas will help you to develop an understanding of which form the poem has been written in. A stanza, a separated verse in the poem, is like a paragraph within the poem, and just like paragraphs, stanzas are used by poets for a specific impact. When we talk about form, we also include the rhyme scheme of the poem. Now let's move to a very important literary device that's only unique for poems, and it's going to take a bit of time to describe it because I think this is the first time you've encountered with it. It's called the poem's meter. Now, meter is a stressed and unstressed syllabic pattern in a verse or within the lines of a poem. Again, meter is a stressed and unstressed syllabic pattern in a verse or within the lines of a poem. Stressed syllables tend to be longer and unstressed syllables shorter. In simple language, meter is a poetic device that serves as a linguistic sound pattern for the verses, as it gives poetry a rhythmical and melodious sound. For instance, if you read the poem aloud and it produces regular sound patterns, then this poem would be a metered or measured poem. The study of different types of versification and meters is known as prosody. Now, in terms of meter and foot, a meter contains a sequence of several feet, where each foot has a number of syllables, such as stressed, unstressed, or unstressed, stressed. Hence, a meter has an overall rhythmic pattern in a line of verse which a foot cannot describe. Now, in English poetry, the poet in English implies or employs 5 basic meters. They include iambic meter, unstressed, stressed. So we have one syllable unstressed followed by one syllable stressed in one foot. Trochaic meter, stressed, unstressed. Spondic meter, stressed, stressed. Anapastic meter, unstressed, unstressed, stressed. Dactylic meter, stressed, unstressed, unstressed. However, for the purpose of this video and this lesson and this poem, we will only be engaged with one meter. It's called the iambic meter, which consists of unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. Let's look how an iambic meter might look like in a poem. Here is one example of the first line of the poem of the Prisoner of Chillon, where he says, "My hair is gray, but not with ears." Now, this is an iambic meter with unstressed followed by a stressed syllable. The red bold-faced syllables are the stressed ones. My is unstressed, hair is stressed. Is unstressed, gray is stressed. But unstressed, not stressed. With unstressed, years stressed. and notice that each foot has 2 syllables. Since this verse has 8 syllables and each foot has 2 syllables, each verse then contains 4 feet. We call these tetra. Tetra stands for 4. Therefore, since it's iambic and each line has 4 feet, then we're going to call this iambic tetrameter. We will apply this in details as we analyze the poem. Now that we know the essential literary devices, let's apply them to the poem. Note that in such a poem, one cannot list all the literary devices used in it, since it is rich in them. For example, one can always find at least one example of simile. But for the purpose of this lesson, the literary devices we have defined will suffice. Let's start with metaphor. Now, what do all these change and images of captivity, broadly speaking, represent? Byron was writing during a time when lots of countries were fighting for freedom from oppressive regimes. Many historians refer to the late 18th century and early 19th century as the age of revolutions. But some poets and other thinkers of the period thought that political tyranny was just one form of captivity that people should fight against. Here's an example from the lines 37 to 40. Byron uses a metaphor to describe the chains. They're like an animal whose teeth leave festering or cankering marks on his arms and legs. Now, what about personification? The dungeon in Chillon is, by and large, really dark and dim, yet there's a ray of light that finds its way into the dungeon at various moments in the poem. What might that light represent? A glimmer of hope? Is it like Galadriel's vial of light in the Lord of the Rings that gives Frodo light in dark places when all other light goes out and everything seems hopeless? In line 30, even the ray of light that makes it into the dungeon seems imprisoned. This personification makes it seem like nothing that enters the dungeon can ever escape again, not even a ray of light. This same light which is personified might be also a symbol of glimmer of hope. In line 31, the light is personified again in this line as the speaker suggests that the ray of light has gotten lost. Again, in line 34, this also can be personification since the light is said to creep along the floor of the dungeon, but you could also read it as a simpler metaphor in which the light is compared to an animal or insect that creeps, rather than to a human being crawling along the floor. However, I would go for personification because it completes the earlier image of the light being personified, and crawling along the floor might not be that of an animal, but as a crippled prisoner, like the speaker, or like the feeble freedom it symbolizes. And what about consonance and parallelism in the poem? The 7 pillars in the dungeon represent the 7 members of the speaker's family who have suffered for their beliefs. Pillars are designed to hold something up, or it makes sense that these men who strive to uphold the beliefs should be associated with pillars. Of course, the real-life prisoner of Chillon, named François Bonnevat, as we mentioned before, didn't have the brothers and father described in Byron's poem, but Byron took a lot of creative liberty with the story. 7 is often an important number in fairy tales, so it makes sense that Byron should choose it in dramatizing Bonnevat's story. If you look at lines 27 to 29 or 27 to 28, there are 7 pillars of the Gothic mold in Chillon's dungeon deep and old. The consonants, the repeated D sound in these lines creates a thudding, echoing sound, like what you'd expect a dungeon to look like or sound like. In lines 36 to 37 In each pillar there is a ring, and in each ring there is a chain. The parallelism between these two lines emphasizes the repetitive, monotonous, dreary lives of the prisoners themselves. Now let's move on to the form and the meter of the poem. The Prison of Chillon is a narrative poem written mostly in iambic tetrameter couplets. Let's explain what that means in simple terms. Now we explained this before, but we're going to explain it again now to make it clearer for you. A narrative poem is just a poem that tells a story instead of a poem that just explains feelings and emotions. The second one, which is the expressing feelings and emotions only, is called a lyric poem. The former one, which tells a story, is called a narrative poem. Iambic tetrameter describes the meter or the pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables in each line. The meter is what gives poetry its rhythm and is the main thing that sets it apart from prose or regular everyday language. Iambic means that the general pattern is to have an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. It's like a da-dum. Each da-dum unit is called an iamb. Tetrameter just means that there are 4 tetra iambs per line. Let's look again at the first line. My hair is gray but not with the ears. If you put the syllables that you'd naturally stress in the bold red, it would look like this. My hair is gray but not with ears. So we have these 4 dadum units, 4 iambs, what we call iambic tetrameter. Now of course Byron does not make it that easy for us as readers. He occasionally breaks the iambic tetrameter to insert 2 shorter lines in iambic diameter, 2 iambs per line. He does this in lines 2 and 3, for example, but then he returns to the usual tetrameter in line 4. So if you look at lines 2 and 3, no grew with white. So here we have 4 syllables, then we have 2 feet. Therefore, here it's not tetrameter, it's diameter because we have 2 feet. This third line, in a single night. So again, we have here 2 feet with 4 syllables. Notice that a before single is a schwa, does not have a sound, and a single night. Again, it's a diameter. But then he goes back to the tetrameter in the 4th line, as men's have grown with sudden fears. So Byron does not make that easy for many reasons. Byron does this again late in the poem, but not part of the selected poem we have chosen for you. Now what do you think the effect is of these sudden breaks into shorter lines? Does it draw your attention to these particular lines more strongly? Why would he want to do that? What's so important about these lines? Whenever we look in detail at the meter or sound of the poem, it's a good idea to ask ourselves what the effect is of the rhythm. Good poets like Byron never do things by accident. Now, most of the poem is rhymed in couplets, or in an AA, BB, CC, DD pattern. Most stanzas, though, in the poem have occasional breaks in that general pattern. Look at stanza 1, lines 1 to 26. The stanza starts with A, B, B, A, then C, D, C, D, but then moves into couplets E, E, F, F, G, G, H, H, until lines 17 to 20, where Byron uses the ABAB pattern. Again, it's IJ, IJ, and then goes back to the couplet pattern KK, LL, MM, the AABB pattern. Why would he switch back and forth? The interlocking pattern of ABAB and ABBA lines suggests that those lines are intimately connected in some way. The pattern forces us to see those lines as a stronger, more complicated unit, rather than the shorter units of the two-line couplets. The two sections of the stanza 1 that are ABBA and ABAB, rather than couplets like AABB, are about the speaker's intimate feeling of spiritual connection with whatever there is in the dungeon, or with his own introspection of his own self. The interlocking ABAB rhyme pattern could be intended to emphasize that sense of connection. The poem is a dramatic monologue where there is a dramatized story told by a speaker as if speaking to himself or to the reader. As you already know, theme is the poet's message, usually about the human nature. By looking at the poet's observations and reactions to something or someone, or the speaker's reaction to something or someone, we can derive the theme. Remember, a theme is not stated in literature. You will need to step back and look at the whole picture without losing sight of the details to find the theme or themes. Also note that the selected poem is only the first 3 stanzas of the whole poem, and so we will only discuss the themes that arise in the first 3 stanzas. Can you find any themes in these 3 stanzas? Pause this video and try to find out based on our analysis of the poem. Let's help you with some of these themes. The poem isn't just about literal imprisonment and the desire for freedom. It's about the different kinds of confinement we face, the mental and emotional as well as physical. 2. The speaker of the prison of Chillon is imprisoned, originally for refusing to back down. Yes, this could look like stubbornness, but it's a trait we are meant to admire. The speaker's father and brothers all die for their beliefs, and the speaker and his 2 remaining brothers are thrown into a dungeon for holding to the same cause. We are never told what the beliefs actually are. It doesn't matter. The point isn't the actual cause the speaker's family was fighting for. The point is that they believed in something strongly enough to die for it. One of the many problems with being imprisoned, number 3, in a dungeon is the lack of society. It's easy to lose perspective when you don't have anyone to talk to. In Prison of Chillon, a prisoner doesn't start out alone. He is thrown into prison initially with his 2 brothers, but after they die, he stops counting the days and just paces around his cell. His mental stagnation is a result of his extreme isolation. If you look at the 3 themes that we've discussed now, can you rephrase the 3 themes in a sentence, complete sentence that reflects the themes?